The USA is such a large, diverse, and these days divided country that at times it is more useful to look at data from individual states than the country as a whole, due to how different the laws, culture, and values can be from one state to another. This does make sense considering that the USA is double the land area of the entire European Union, has a population of over 345 million people as of 2024, and is home to some of the most stark subdivisional differences between regions in the developed world. For these reasons and more, one can imagine just how much different states diverge when it comes to LGBTQ rights. Some states are literally world-leading, like Massachusetts. If Massachusetts were its own country, it would be the second best in the world for queer rights, ahead of Norway and behind only Iceland according to data from Equaldex. In contrast to this, other states in the country are far worse for LGBTQ people, and today, these are the states we are going to be exploring in depth. This is especially useful information for those who are thinking of future travel to the US and want to know which locations are best to avoid, and is also useful to people already within the US who are curious where they should avoid moving to at all costs. The way we are going to accomplish this is simple. Two of the absolute most trusted resources when it comes to measuring LGBTQ rights are the Movement Advancement Project and Equaldex. The Movement Advancement Project awards points for both sexual orientation and gender identity-related legislation that covers 7 different categories. The maximum points that a state can earn is 44.5, so as an example, a score above 40 would be nearly perfect. Equaldex, on the other hand, awards a maximum of 100 points, and notably takes public opinion data into account along with legislation. Today, we are going to average out the scores each state receives from both the Movement Advancement Project and Equaldex, so that we have a well-rounded final ranking today, taking nearly every factor into account. Interestingly, despite having slightly different methodologies, both resources agree on the top 6 worst states for queer people, adding to the reliability of this list today. I always like to use multiple sources of high reputation instead of relying on only one, as to make sure that we are getting the absolute best data across metrics. And, for those who enjoy digging deeper into the data, you can find links in the description to both sources. I personally find the information linked below to be very interesting and even fun to look through. Plus, if you want to dig deeper into a specific state that I do not mention in this video, you can easily do that. And on that note, let's now dive into the first state on this list of shame. Coming in as the 6th worst state in the country for LGBTQ rights is one that may be literally underwater in the near future, but is already underwater in terms of religious extremism and anti-queer legislation. You may have heard that Louisiana has recently mandated every public school classroom in the state have a copy of the Christian 10 Commandments clearly displayed in eyesight of students. So, let's get this straight. Conservatives whine and cry about having pride flags in classrooms and say they are indoctrinating children, but then support literally forcing religion on kids who may come from families who find such beliefs to be extremely offensive. So let me make something clear to Louisiana and anyone else who is still confused. State-sponsored religious indoctrination is some third world shit, and how dare you cry about LGBTQ ideology in schools when you were blatantly peddling Christian ideology, a far more violent, dangerous, and harmful set of beliefs than simply accepting everyone for who they are. And, rant aside, the data is clear in its condemnation of Louisiana, and no amount of Cajun seasoning and gumbo can cover up the state's abysmal treatment of queer people, which, while still above average by global standards, is also far below what one would expect from a rich country that prides itself for valuing liberty and freedom. According to the Movement Advancement Project, Louisiana receives an overall score of -7.5, but performs particularly poorly in terms of trans rights, where it specifically gets a -8. It is impossible to change one's gender marker on Louisiana driver's license and birth certificates without first completing gender reassignment surgery, and no third or non-binary gender option is available. There is also no ban on so-called panic defense claims, meaning that theoretically, someone is allowed to attack and even unalive someone if they claim they panicked upon finding out the person was homosexual or trans. This in particular is not just wrong, it is wicked, unjust, and brings shame upon the state and country beyond measure. Equaldex, which scores on a different scale, gives Louisiana 59 points, which is also the 6th worst scoring state in the USA, but remains high by global standards as discussed earlier. It only secures as high of a score as it does, primarily owing to the fact that despite its many terrible laws, federal law in the USA means that queer people do still have access to marriage equality, and that gender-affirming care for adults is legal, just to name a few positive highlights. Clearly, Louisiana still has a very long way to come, and is one state that queer people should try to avoid whenever possible, as we barely scratched the surface on all their terrible laws. But for those who do decide to visit anyway, the largest city in the state, New Orleans, is generally considered to be an LGBTQ-friendly city, and its residents have consistently voted for progressive Democrat lawmakers, despite the majority of the state being overwhelmingly leaning to the far radical religious right wing. New Orleans does not follow the hateful ideologies entrenched in much of the state, and is home to some incredible Cajun and Creole food that many people dream of trying at least once in their lives. But outside of the city is where things get sketchy, and is why I cannot recommend the state as a whole until things fundamentally change. Moving now to the very next state east of Louisiana, we are staying in the deep south and come to the 5th worst state in the USA for our community, Mississippi. The Movement Advancement Project gives the state an overall score of -7 points for LGBTQ rights, and, like Louisiana, the situation for trans people is particularly bad in the state. The state permits religious-based discrimination of queer people, including allowing for hateful religious clerks to refuse issuing marriage certificates to queer couples, even though marriage equality is a law of the land across the United States. And, as every other state on this list of shame, Mississippi also has yet to ban conversion therapy, which, for those who do not know, is essentially a process where children are sent to concentration camps where they are manipulated, abused, and scared into claiming they are no longer queer. Obviously, this barbaric practice does not work, but the fact children in 2024 are still suffering conversion therapy is sickening and angering beyond words. For those interested in learning about this subject, I recommend a movie called Boy Erased, which covers the psychological horrors of conversion therapy. Also, like Louisiana, there is no ban on the panic defense argument being made in court to justify unaliving a queer person in a panicked response, which is just too evil to even comprehend. Now, Equaldex gives Mississippi a score of 57 points, which means it would be tied with the Philippines if it were an independent country. Because, like every other state in the USA, the federal government guarantees certain fundamental rights for LGBTQ residents of Mississippi, which is why the state still performs decently when put on a global scale, despite its many disturbing and backwards laws. For those who still want to visit Mississippi despite all of this, my honest opinion is that it's simply not a good idea unless you have a specific reason. But for those who absolutely must visit for one reason or another, the capital city of Jackson is a relatively progressive city that has voted Democrat consistently and has gone slightly above and beyond the state standard for LGBTQ rights, with passing some additional non-discrimination laws. Still, Mississippi is a state best left avoided unless absolutely necessary, as there are so many states that are not only more interesting, but more importantly are more friendly to our community, and thus more deserving of our support. And this is coming from someone who has visited 46 states out of 50 states, including each one on this list. Staying in the south but moving a good deal east until we are on the Atlantic coast, we arrive in a state that is tied with Mississippi as the 5th worst state in the USA for LGBTQ rights. South Carolina. The Movement Advancement Project gives South Carolina a combined score of -8, but as we are consistently finding on this list, things are exceptionally bad for trans people in the state. Essentially, every terrible law already covered for the previous 2 states holds true in South Carolina, including those relating to conversion therapy and the usage of the panic defense argument in court. In addition to these laws, trans people are also unable to change gender on any document without surgery, religious groups and individuals in the state are freely permitted to discriminate against queer people at their whim, as long as they can claim their religion allows them to do so, and schools are forced to report and out trans kids to their parents, which often leads to abuse at home and eventual homelessness. Now, with a score of 58 points from Equaldex, South Carolina is technically on par with countries like Cyprus, Bolivia, and Croatia, but this is due to the fact fact that being a part of the USA means that certain fundamental rights are federally guaranteed, and because public opinion is relatively high by global standards in the state. These are the only real reasons for South Carolina still pulling off a globally competitive score. But despite the state being a relatively decent place to be LGBTQ when compared with much of the world, compared to other states and to developed countries, it is without a doubt one of the worst, and thus is best to be avoided if at all possible. Like all states bordering the Atlantic Ocean, South Carolina has beaches and beach cities that attract visitors, and the western portion of the state is home to some beautiful forests and small mountains. But nearby states like North Carolina, Virginia, and even Georgia share nearly all of these traits, plus have larger and more interesting cities, along with more progressive policies relating to LGBTQ rights. But for those who have a reason why they need to visit South Carolina anyway, the city of Charleston is gorgeous and full of history, great food, and a relatively accepting populace that consistently votes for more progressive and pro-queer Democrat candidates. One unique feature of the USA is just how dramatic the urban-rural divide in the country is. Nearly every city in the country with a population over 100,000 votes majorly for progressive policies and candidates. And while this divide exists almost everywhere in the world, nowhere is it more stark than the USA. Even the most backwards and religious states still have pockets of freedom and liberty in their urban cores, where the vast majority of people disagree with the policies of the state as a whole and openly support LGBTQ rights. You will notice that even the cities and the states that are covered on this list are solidly blue. But America's electoral system favors rural voters through the Electoral College and through gerrymandering within states for local elections. So while I would personally not want to support South Carolina as a state with my tourism, or want to move there under any circumstances, there certainly are locations in the state, like Charleston and the capital Columbia, where it is possible to do so safely and ethically. For our next state, it is probably a surprise to few that we are staying in the South, and heading to Alabama, a state that is famous for incest, but should be equally famous for its systematic persecution of queer people. The Movement Advancement Project gives Alabama a combined score of negative 10.5, and as usual for these states, trans people are especially targeted. Alabama is one of 8 states where teachers are literally fired if they do not out trans kids to their parents, which often results in unthinkable outcomes like homelessness and even self-unaliving due to parental bullying. Conversion therapy is not banned, panic killing of queer individuals is permitted, and religious people are legally protected when discriminating against our community. It goes without saying that Alabama is across the board one of the worst states in the USA, has some of the highest rates of church attendance in the country, and some of the worst educational and economic outcomes. Isn't it interesting how places that attack queer people are often just shittier for everyone than their progressive counterparts? It's generally this way with countries around the world, and even in subdivisions within countries. Equaldex gives Alabama a score of 57, and if it were an independent country, like Mississippi, it would be tied with the Philippines, ranked 55th in the world for LGBTQ rights. Once again, this is really only due to positive countrywide federal-level legislation, and if Alabama were independent, it would likely plummet down the rankings as it would almost definitely roll back federal protections for things like marriage equality. For those interested in visiting Alabama or considering moving to the state, honestly just don't. But if you absolutely have to, the cities of Birmingham and Montgomery lean progressive in their voting patterns and have a far more visible queer community than the rest of the state. Many people visit South Alabama beaches in the Gulf of Mexico, but these areas lean extremely conservative and religious, so ethically speaking, I would recommend picking a different beach destination in other parts of the US, Mexico, or the Caribbean, as there is nothing in Alabama you can't find in other relatively nearby locations, under better circumstances surrounded by better people. Moving west now, but once again staying in the South, we arrive in Arkansas, a state that is usually the butt of some joke, but let me warn you, its record on LGBTQ rights is really not funny. The Movement Advancement Project gives Arkansas a score of negative 12.5, and not to sound redundant, but once again, this state not only receives a negative 3 for its laws relating to sexual orientation, but also receives a staggering negative 9.5 for gender policy. The state law in Arkansas literally bans individual cities within the state from passing non-discrimination laws, which is absolutely wild to consider. Once again, religious-based discrimination is legal against queer people, conversion therapy therapy is not banned, schools are forbidden from discussing LGBTQ people and subjects, and the state also allows the panic defense argument to be made in court, essentially allowing someone to unalive a queer person and claim they did it out of panic upon finding out their identity. These laws just scratch the surface, and there are many other terrible ones that we could talk about for an hour, but for me, what stands out especially vile is that cities in the state are banned from passing non-discrimination laws, meaning that even urban centers like Arkansas's capital, Little Rock, are far less safe and accepting than other leading cities in the South, which have independently implemented certain positive laws. Now, Equaldex gives Arkansas a score of 57, the same as it gave Alabama, meaning that it too would be ranked at the level of the Philippines if it were independent. But once again, this comes down to various positive federal laws like marriage equality, which raise the state's score, a score that would quickly fall far lower than the Philippines if these federal laws were ever gone. In light of this and so much more that is out of the scope of today's video, take my word that Arkansas absolutely does not need to be on anyone's bucket list unless you have a reason why you literally need to visit. This is especially true considering that even the urban centers of Arkansas are unable to stand up to the state government, as is done in cities in most other states. But if you are trying to visit every state or find yourself passing through Arkansas, the only place I recommend visiting in the state is Hot Springs National Park. Money spent within the park goes to the National Park Service and is used to protect nature, buy more land for conservation, and is certainly not going to support Arkansas itself, as it is federal land. But unless you are in the state already, there are scores of other national parks across the country located on less hostile land, and that are far more spectacular and more deserving of your time and money. Seriously, the USA has some of the best national parks in the world. Just give them an internet search, and you will see how many better ones there are than Hot Springs anyway. So in summary, best to avoid Arkansas when possible. Before we dive into the final state on our list today, I just wanted to take a moment to invite you personally to become a citizen of the Queer Kingdom and to join our quickly growing community. You can officially join the Queer Kingdom here on YouTube for $1 a month, which most importantly will help me make this channel my full-time focus as soon as possible. You will also get access to some cute custom queer emojis and epic crown icons next to your comments on this channel that change and evolve the longer you are a member. Also, while monthly live streams are always public, they are eventually moved to the members-only feed afterwards, and controversial videos covering heavy subjects that are not quite YouTube-friendly are also privately posted for citizens of the kingdom so that we can all stay informed. And finally, joining the Queer Kingdom here on YouTube gives you the ability to chat with me and fellow members through access to our new Queer Kingdom Members Discord. I greatly look forward to meeting you and working together to create a safe and prosperous world for our people, one step at a time. And now, the absolute worst state for LGBTQ rights in all of the USA in 2024 is Tennessee, the home of country music, Nashville hot chicken, and pathetic levels of anti-queer hostility. The Movement Advancement Project gives Tennessee a score of -14, and yes, once again, the laws in the state target trans people with a particular brutality. The same negative laws already discussed for other states on this list also apply to Tennessee, but I will note that like Arkansas, the state government of Tennessee has also banned its cities from passing their own non-discrimination legislation. Another law that goes above and beyond the other states on this list is that trans people are unable to change their gender markers on legal documents even if they have had gender reassignment surgery. Also, drag performances are essentially banned in the state in most all circumstances, but perhaps most shockingly of all is that Tennessee, like Mississippi, allows for its officials to deny queer people marriage certificates despite marriage equality being the law of the land across the USA. So while queer couples can still marry in Tennessee, local officials are legally allowed to decline to marry couples of whose marriage they disapprove of on religious grounds, meaning the couple will just have to wait until a normal clerk is available who is not fuming with hate and anger against people loving one another. Equaldex gives Tennessee a score of 56 points, which if it were a country would place it 1 point behind the Philippines and 1 point ahead of Monaco. And, as is true for the other states on this list, the relatively high score received is due mostly to federal law and not because of the state itself, which if it had its own way, would be a far more hostile place to be LGBTQ and would quickly dismantle the federal protections currently in place. So, when it comes to visiting Tennessee, it hurts a bit to advise against it. Because Nashville is quite a progressive city with a beautiful skyline, amazing restaurants, and so much music and culture to enjoy, but despite this, it's hard to stomach just how evil the state's governor and larger government is, and that it bans cities like Nashville from passing their own non-discrimination laws. Still, for those who have a good reason to pay the state a visit anyway, and want to do so safely and ethically, Nashville itself is a city where queer people are generally considered to be safe, and it does vote for progressive candidates, highlighting how different it is from the majority of the state. In the east, you can find Smoky Mountains National Park, and of course, money spent in the park once again goes to the National Park Service, not to Tennessee. It is a beautiful piece of land, and one that you can visit with a clear conscience. Dollywood, for those who are a fan of Dolly Parton, is also relatively near this national park, and as she is a solid ally to the community, it can be worth a visit for those passing through and wanting to experience some authentic country vibes. Still, and as mentioned for other states on this list, I would not recommend seeking out Tennessee, or even the national park that it hosts, when many accepting states are more deserving of our time and money, and are home to equally impressive, if not more impressive, national parks, and opportunities for recreation and experiencing untainted American culture. You may have noticed that each state on this list of shame have a few things in common. Yes, they are all southern states, but perhaps more importantly than their location is the fact that they are some of the most religious states in the country, have some of the worst education outcomes in the country, and, while wealthy by global standards, all having a GDP per capita higher than Germany and Japan, still struggle with income inequality and poverty in certain communities. This high religiosity, combined with poor educational outcomes and relative poverty compared to the rest of the USA, has combined to create a breeding ground for hate, backwards thinking, and scapegoating of others. Politicians in these states particularly would rather stir up culture wars than actually putting in the hard work to make these states better places to live, as that would require far more effort than whining about our community and using religious rants to win the loyalty of uneducated and unhappy people. Still, despite their shortcomings, these states are home to urban centers that seek to protect human rights as much as they can against attacks from their local state legislators. But considering how many incredible and gorgeous states there are, many of which rival the Nordics in terms of queer rights, I still believe for the majority of people it is wise to skip these 6 states and adventure in other parts of the country, where you will be more welcome, safer, and able to enjoy a more vibrant place with more spectacular natural landscapes. And for those currently living in these 6 states, I wish you all the luck in the world, leaving them as soon as possible, and until that is possible, it is my hope that you stay vigilant and safe, and know that there are better places in the world, and even in this country where things truly do get better. And now, for today's queer news story, we are heading to Scotland, where a radical Afro-Christian cult centered on homophobic exorcisms is being granted charity status by the Scottish government. Forward in Faith Christian International Incorporated was founded in Zimbabwe in 1960, praises the virtues of women providing on-demand sex for their husbands, believes that demons cause people to be LGBTQ, and frequently accuses people of witchcraft, which they believe should be punished. This barbaric organization has been granted charity status already in England and Wales, and when pressed on the matter, the Charity Commission for England and Wales claimed that there was no evidence that FIFCII was advocating a particular position on homosexuality, despite the blog posts on their website clearly endorsing persecution of homosexuals. This double standard is far too common in the UK and the Western world in general, where bigoted groups comprised mostly of local-born residents are rightfully cracked down upon, but those propagated by foreigners are given a pass in the name of inclusivity, no matter how vile their beliefs are. All extremism is wrong, and the fact that certain groups are being granted the go-ahead to preach their primitive beliefs are not only harmful to the community, but undermine the entire political systems in countries like the UK due to the blatant double standards. Many Western governments only want to protect queer people until they have to call out non-native residents to do so, then they are silent and allow for our persecution. Thank you, friends, for watching and spending time today with me as we seek to spread the word about important topics in the community. For those interested, you are more than welcome to stay around and join our increasingly powerful kingdom here on YouTube as we fight for our future. Until next time, QK out.